The small town of Hollow Ridge, nestled in the mountains, was a quiet, almost idyllic place. It had an air of timeless tranquility, with its cobblestone streets, quaint shops, and friendly townsfolk who knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where the days seemed to blend into one another in a peaceful monotony. Until the disappearances began. It started with a young woman named Lily, who vanished without a trace on her way home from the local diner. Then, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson went missing after his evening walk. The town was shaken, but the worst was yet to come. For in the heart of Hollow Ridge, something sinister was awakening, and the shadows began to whisper of a dark presence that had taken root in their midst. Chapter 1: The Arrival. Detective Sarah Blake had seen her share of horror during her years with the city police force, but nothing could have prepared her for the call she received one crisp autumn morning. She was sent to Hollow Ridge to assist the local authorities in solving the mystery of the missing townsfolk. Sarah was a seasoned investigator, known for her tenacity and sharp instincts, but as she drove through the winding mountain roads to reach Hollow Ridge, a sense of unease settled over her. The town seemed almost too perfect, as if it were hiding a dark secret beneath its picturesque facade. Upon her arrival, she was greeted by Sheriff Tom Harding, a grizzled man with a stern expression and a deep sense of worry etched into his features. "Thank you for coming, Detective Blake," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "We need all the help we can get. These disappearances are unlike anything we've ever dealt with." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the town. "Let's get to work, Sheriff. We need to find out what's happening here before more people go missing." Chapter 2: The Investigation Begins. Sarah and Sheriff Harding started their investigation by interviewing the families of the missing persons. Each story was eerily similar. The victims had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clues or signs of struggle. The only common thread was a series of unsettling occurrences that preceded their disappearances: strange noises at night, fleeting shadows seen out of the corner of their eyes, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. As they delved deeper, Sarah stumbled upon an old legend that the townsfolk whispered about: the legend of the Hollow Ridge Killer. According to the tales, a series of brutal murders had taken place in the town over a century ago, committed by a man named Jonathan Crane. He was a recluse who lived in the outskirts of the town, and his victims were found with their bodies mutilated and their hearts missing. The townsfolk had eventually captured and lynched him, but his spirit was said to haunt the town, seeking revenge on the descendants of those who had wronged him. Chapter 3: The Haunted Manor. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah and Sheriff Harding decided to visit the old Crane Manor, a decaying mansion that had been abandoned for decades. The manor stood at the edge of a dense forest, its once grand structure now reduced to a crumbling ruin. As they approached, a sense of foreboding washed over them, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. Inside, the manor was a maze of dark, dusty corridors and rooms filled with decaying furniture. The walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of the past, and shadows danced in the corners of their vision. In the basement, they discovered a hidden room filled with old, yellowing newspaper clippings and journals that chronicled the life of Jonathan Crane. The journals revealed his descent into madness, driven by a twisted belief that he could achieve immortality by consuming the hearts of his victims. As Sarah read through the journals, she felt a presence watching her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Suddenly, a cold, bony hand grasped her shoulder, and she spun around, her heart pounding. But there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness and the whispers of the dead. Chapter 4: The First Clue. Amidst the journals and clippings, Sarah found a map of the town with certain locations marked in red. These locations corresponded to where the recent disappearances had occurred. It was as if someone was following a twisted ritual, reenacting the murders of Jonathan Crane. Back at the sheriff's office, they pored over the map and the details of the disappearances. "If this is a pattern," Sarah said, pointing to the next marked location, "we need to be there before it happens again." That night, they staked out the location, a small, abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. The hours passed slowly, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Just when they began to think it was a false lead, they heard a blood-curdling scream. Chapter 5: The Chase. Sarah and Sheriff Harding rushed towards the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found a young woman, tied to a tree and struggling against her bonds. As they freed her, she sobbed in terror, pointing towards the shadows. "He was here. He tried to kill me." Before they could question her further, a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow with a malevolent light, the figure of Jonathan Crane stood before them. He moved with an unnatural speed and agility, disappearing into the forest before they could react. Determined not to lose him, Sarah and the sheriff gave chase, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air filled with an eerie whispering. They followed the figure deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the darkness more oppressive. Chapter 6: The Confrontation. They finally caught up with Crane at the edge of a clearing, where an ancient stone altar stood, covered in strange symbols and dried blood. Crane was chanting in a language they couldn't understand, his eyes fixed on the altar. As they approached, he turned to face them, a twisted smile on his lips. "You can't stop me," he hissed, his voice a rasping whisper. "I will complete the ritual and live forever." Sarah and the sheriff drew their weapons, but Crane moved with supernatural speed, dodging their bullets and striking with inhuman strength. The fight was fierce, and just when it seemed Crane would overpower them, Sarah remembered the journals. The key to defeating Crane lay in disrupting the ritual. With a desperate lunge, she knocked over the altar, scattering the ritual objects. Crane let out a scream of rage and pain, his body convulsing as the dark energy that sustained him began to unravel. In a final, desperate act, he lunged at Sarah, but the sheriff fired a shot that struck him square in the chest. Crane fell to the ground, his body dissolving into shadows that dissipated into the night. The forest grew still, and an eerie silence settled over the clearing. Chapter 7: The Aftermath. Back in Hollow Ridge, the disappearances ceased, and the town began to heal from the horrors it had endured. The young woman they had rescued was reunited with her family, and the townsfolk slowly returned to their normal lives. Sarah stayed in Hollow Ridge for a few more days, helping the sheriff tie up loose ends and ensure that no remnants of Crane's dark influence remained. They sealed the manor and the altar, vowing never to speak of the horrors they had witnessed. As she prepared to leave, Sheriff Harding thanked her for her help. "You saved this town, Detective Blake. We owe you our lives." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already on the road ahead. She had faced darkness and emerged victorious, but she knew there were other shadows lurking in the world, waiting to be confronted. Epilogue: The Whispering Shadows. Years later, Sarah had left the police force and settled into a quieter life. But the memories of Hollow Ridge stayed with her, a reminder of the darkness that could exist in the most unexpected places. One night, as she sat by her fireplace, she heard a faint whispering. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and for a moment, she felt the cold, bony hand on her shoulder once more. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her from Hollow Ridge, a dark presence that lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As she stared into the flickering flames, she vowed to remain vigilant. For she knew that in the world of shadows and whispers, the battle against the darkness was never truly over.
Don't forget to subscribe.